Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I see the virtual room filling up. So we'll just give everyone a few minutes to join online and we'll get started. It's going to be a full room this morning. Up over 100 participants and climbing. That's fantastic. So in the interest of time, we've got a packed agenda, so I will get us started. Welcome this morning or this afternoon, depending where you're joining from, to the first event in our Clean Recovery Breakthrough Series focused on buildings. I'm Elizabeth Shirt with Globe Series. Also on your screen is Toby Heaps with Corporate Knights, and we are your co-hosts for today's event. The Clean Recovery Breakthrough Series is where thought leaders from across the country are shaping the moment of transformation that Canada has found itself in. Together, we're identifying industrial breakthrough opportunities that reduce carbon, attract investment, create jobs, and position Canada as a global leader in the clean recovery, moving us from task to action to outcomes. Our event here today is the first of our buildings track and is focused on breakthroughs inspired by buildings. But before we kick off, I want to make sure that I acknowledge that I have the privilege of joining you today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations, also known as Vancouver. And I'd just like to invite each of you now to reflect on the land you're joining us from. And you can get flexing and practicing with that interactivity muscle by letting us know in the chat any details on the connection you feel with the place that you live or work, or another place that you might feel a connection to. So I'd invite you to do that now using the chat function. We're going to be together here from across the country and beyond for the next 60 minutes. And over that hour, we'll hear from expert actors in the building space, Chandos, Ivanhoe Cambridge, and Schneider Electric. We'll welcome during this time comments from you, the audience, using the chat, and questions using the Q&A widget that's at the bottom of your screen. So be sure when you're sending comments in the chat that you select all panelists and attendees so everyone can see them. And to ask a question of our panelists, you can navigate again to that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can also use that function to upvote other people's questions. So if you see a question in the Q&A that you think is spot on, go ahead and upvote that. Be sure to use that function. So to help us frame the event today, and so we also have a sense of the perspectives that we have in the virtual room, I'm going to invite you now to respond to a poll that we're going to bring up on screen. And so we know that deep decarbonization has potential to contribute significantly to GDP growth. So we want to know today from you, those of you in the room, what share of this growth do you believe can be driven by decarbonization of buildings? So we'll give everybody a quick moment to place your vote, and then we'll have a look at the results and see what the sense is in the room. I'm going to make sure I place my vote. Awesome. All right. Without further ado, I do want to hand it back to Toby to kick off our moderated discussion. I'll just see if we have those poll results to share. There they are. So between 20 and 39% seems to be the predominant view, Toby. So I'll hand it to you now to kick us off, and we'll get things started.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. Interesting to see the poll results. We have with us a lot of people who are active in the sector. According to the analysis that we did with Ralph Torre and Celine Back, looking at the full scope of decarbonization opportunities in terms of job growth and GDP enhancements, the green building part of the equation is about half of the total potential job creation and GDP growth. So it's really sizable when you put it up against electric vehicles and grid, the greening of the grid, and the nature-based solutions. The building piece is huge and significant. It's a real pleasure to be able to welcome our three speakers with us today. we are fortunate to have three of people of extreme expertise that have passed the Malcolm Gladwell threshold of 10,000 hours mastering their craft. And it brings together three perspectives. We have with us Tim Caldwell, who's the president of Chandos, one of Canada's greenest builders. And Tim is a real pioneer in this space. And so we're really happy that he can join with us today. He represents the builder perspective. We also have with us Rob Simpson, who's the director of sustainability at Ivanhoe Cambridge. Ivanhoe Cambridge is a real estate investor, one of Canada's most significant real estate investors, a global real estate investor, a part of the cohort of 12 real estate investors in Canada who control collectively $500 billion and make us a real global heavyweight in terms of the real estate investment space. We're one of the world's largest commercial landlords right here from Canada. And Ivanhoe Cambridge is rated as the top most sustainable real estate investor in North America by GRESB, which is a third-party body that does really credible ratings in this area. We also have with us Hugo Lafontaine, and Hugo represents Schneider Electric, which is really focused on the digital solution piece of optimizing buildings for their resource productivity, namely energy productivity. And also happy to report that Schneider Electric was this year ranked as the most sustainable company on the planet in the Corporate Knights Global 100. So real pleasure to have you three with us here today. Before we get underway with the questions, we just want to provide people with a bit of a perspective of where our three speakers are coming from, in addition to my brief remarks. So in order, we're going to go with Tim, Rob, and Hugo, and they're each going to share just a little bit about who they are and what they do in terms of the perspective they bring today. Tim?
Thanks, Toby and Elizabeth. It's great to be here today. Just a little bit of context on our organization. We are a purpose-driven national technical builder. So we're the largest B Corp certified contractor in the world. We have offices in Vancouver, Kelowna, Edmonton, Red Deer, Calgary, Toronto, and Ottawa. Founded in 1980, 500 employees, revenues of, call it, 800 million. And one of the things that we've specialized in over the years is large-scale renovations to occupied, in many cases, mission-critical facilities. So we're talking about peeling off the building envelope floor by floor in a fully occupied residential or high-rise office tower, going through floor by floor by floor, gutting out mechanical, electrical systems, replacing them. That's the kind of work that we really gravitate towards. And that kind of work is inextricably associated with energy retrofits. So really happy to be here today and looking forward to the conversation.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon. My name is Rob Simpson with Ivanhoe Cambridge. Toby and Elizabeth, thank you for the introduction. You mentioned, Toby, a little bit about Ivanhoe. We're a large global real estate player with assets in all the major asset classes around the globe, both operationally and from a design and construction and development perspective, as well as the investment side of the business. So we have a significant role to play in the global space with respect to buildings and decarbonization. We've done a lot of work in this area, but we have a long way to go, and happy to be here and talk about that with the other panelists. Thank you.
Hugo?
Oh, perfect. So glad to be here today. I guess two angles, right? One, from my personal perspective, right? 20 years in the industry of building automation, building technologies, bringing different innovations in a building environment. And from a Schneider standpoint, you look at Schneider, it's a global company, and I'm pretty proud about being voted the #1 sustainability company in the world, right? We're in most countries around the world. We've evolved from a steel manufacturer to a electrical company to now what we call a technology company, right? Where it's how you bridge both hardware and software into the environment of a building, industries, and so on. And fundamentally, I think what we're trying to bring to the table is how do we digitize, decentralize, and decarbonize our environment, right? And this is really where we want to achieve as a company, part of our own DNA, but also part of what we bring to the table for customers.
Okay, thanks. Much appreciated. So let's jump right into the questions. Elizabeth and I are going to volley question to question. I'll kick off with the first question. If you can try and focus your comments, responses in that 2-minute realm, that will give us time to get through everything. So the first question is, what are the biggest opportunities to drive deep decarbonization of buildings that you're seeing in your various realms? Let's go same order, Tim, Rob, Ugo.
Yeah, I would say, I want to actually spin that around a little bit and start with the challenge. I think the challenge is that many owners, particularly government owners in Canada, think that the payback on a major energy retrofit that involves replacing the envelope and the roof, and in many other instances, they think the payback is, call it 6 to 8 years. You can get a payback that's in the 6 to 8 year range when you're only replacing mechanical electrical systems in the building and not touching much else. But the reality is most of these buildings in Canada are at the end of life already. The envelope is full of mold and asbestos. The interior space layout is antiquated, all sorts of issues with the building. So when you look at these jobs and you say, well, what's it going to take to extend the life of this building by an extra 30 years? You get into paybacks that are in the 20-year range. And usually what ends up happening is the owner has to rationalize, okay, I got to plow that kind of money into this. I'm going to have an energy savings, but when I do this, my building life is extended by 30 years and I don't have to build other buildings. And I am now reducing our carbon footprint because the most efficient building you build is the one you never build. And so that kind of a thought process, I think, really drives the conversation. And I don't see it happening as much as it should.
Thanks. Rob?
Sure. So, I mean, those are some great points that Tim raised, and we can certainly speak to those, or I can speak to those as an owner of the approach there. But, from the real estate owner perspective, buildings account for about 40%, approximately 40% of global carbon emissions. So the opportunity to have an impact in this space for us is significant, obviously. And it's imperative upon us, or incumbent upon us, to ensure that we're providing real estate at the scale and to the quality to continue to attract tenants over the long term. And as we've seen, particularly in the last few months, with the increased awareness around this, and through COVID, everything has been expedited, certainly to a significant degree. How are we positioning ourselves so that we've got attractive real estate that can be leased? Somebody joked to me a few years ago that a green building is a leased building, and there's certainly some merit to that. There's no sense of having an empty building. So how do we ensure that we're providing buildings that are healthy and safe, that are low carbon or no carbon, that are efficient, that are cost effective, and that are attracting and retaining tenants over a long period of time? So for us, that's the value proposition that we're working towards.
Good angle. So I'll add kind of my angle on it, right? So when you look at the big picture, right? So the building industry, the construction industry is one of the least digitized one we have, right? You look at aerospatial industries, they can really leverage technology and data, right? In our buildings right now, they're getting older, tear downs. I mean, if you start playing with steel and cement, we know that 16% of the emission is just by fabricating that product, right? So we need to keep our buildings or find ways of building our buildings differently. We need to also leverage what we have, right? And one of the big challenges we have right now is that, first of all, we're not digitized where we should be. Two, there's a fear of change, and there's a problem with people accepting what we want to try to impose on them, right? We're trying to change the way they interact in the building. The operators are not ready for technologies. There's a lot of different things there. But the opportunity is, right, is first of all, we know we have to change the way we operate our buildings, the way they're efficient, the resilience we have in them. There's a lot of different technologies out there that are coming out. The acceptance from a personal perspective, the tenant, the people coming in the building, they're ready to accept different technologies. The cost of technology has gone down, right? So you can think about networking, cybersecurity, energy capacity, energy absorption, energy storage, the sensors. There's tons of different options out there. Now the challenge is how do we bring all these together to achieve our common goal of decarbonizing and reducing our footprint from an energy standpoint? So I think the time is now. The question is how we're going to do it, right?
Ugo, that's it. It's a great segue. So thanks for that. I wanted to dig next with the group into based on those technology opportunities and barriers, what are the ways that business models and practices need to evolve to capitalize on those? And so, Ugo, maybe I'll start with you, just given your comments there in terms of the challenges of acceptance, the notion that operators, owners, residents, tenants alike just may not be there yet. How do we shift business models and practices to drive that acceptance?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I mean, like I think when you look at how the business model is kind of broken a bit, right? You look at how we build our things. It's just a bunch of silos coming together, right? We have a vision, then we go to consulting phase, and we have mechanical consultant, electrical consultant, structural technology guys. They all start gluing their concepts together. Then we try to go to a construction phase where we go and we ask for lower price to go in, right? And we have contractors bidding, subcontractors. We put all these people together. We expect a building that's going to operate and align with our vision, right? And that is where fundamentally we need to change the model, where it's no longer about reducing the CapEx. It is about maximizing the OpEx, maximizing the life cycle, the carbon reduction over a period of time. It's a full vision of the whole life cycle of your building, right? And then how do we bring these people that can bring value and yet pay a fair price for it and maximize what we need to do as a community, as a society, to reduce the impact the buildings have in our environment, right? And in the day we have a building that works as one with technologies, with systems, with products that make sense, then you can have multiple buildings in a city and you create what we call a smart city or a city that is carbon neutral. Then you really compound the effect of one building by multiple buildings. And this is the only way we're going to achieve that, by using a methodology that allows us to break the silos, maximize the impact environment, and work as one, creating an ecosystem that's viable for us.
Great comments, Hugo. And Tim, I know you're going to have perspectives on this as one of the important players in that value chain and that system. What are your thoughts? How do business models and practices need to shift from your perspective as a builder and an organization really active in that retrofit space?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with what Hugo has mentioned. In the general contracting world, even in the trade world, procurement and delivery methods are the tail that wag the dog. And Chandos is Canada's leader by a significant margin in a delivery method called integrated project delivery. And you get the key project participants together at the beginning: the mechanical trade, the electrical trade, the mechanical and electrical engineers, the architect, the owner, the user groups, the entire stakeholder spectrum. And you develop the business case for the project together. And then you incentivize the project participants around a common goal that defines success for the owner. That's a very, very disruptive way of delivering buildings. We've had a ton of success with it over the years. And the other piece I would mention is this kind of the rate of change and innovation that's happening in our industry. If you take the traditional approach and you hire a design team and you put together a design and you can take it out to the market, get permits and tender it, by the time you go through that process, the technology that you specified is often obsolete. And so there's a real power in getting the actual manufacturers at the table who are creating these systems, and then figuring out how to have them at the table so that the latest and greatest can actually be integrated into the building. There's a lot of opportunity there in terms of delivering value for clients.
Thanks, Tim. Rob, of course, I want to go to you as an owner and the space that you operate in. What does this look like for you, those shifts in business models? And Hugo and Tim have outlined some key ways that needs to shift. So what does that look like for you? But also, what are some of the risks in that? What are, as we look at making those shifts and changes towards that decarbonized future, what are the risks in making those adjustments?
Sure, I mean, there's a number of things. There's obviously technology solutions that we need to continue to develop. There's building better that we need to continue to work on and figure out ways how to, to Hugo's point on the life cycle assessment, how are we actually accounting for embodied carbon through our construction processes? And that's something we're working on. But I think one of the key things for us is, we've been at the efficiency game for quite a long time as an industry, and we've made significant strides from an efficiency perspective. But at the end of the day, a building is going to require power. You've got to turn lights on. You've got to operate it. that requires power. You can make it as efficient as possible, but you can't make it efficient to zero. So how are you then finding clean sources of energy that are providing the power that you in fact need to operate, that are going to be low carbon? So there's obviously a huge play to be made from the sourcing of power from renewables, clean energy perspectives, and those are things that we're trying to do better in and advance that equally as part of the equation. I think historically we've been a bit caught up in finding single solutions, and we know now that single solutions are not the answer to the whole problem. They're a piece, but there are multiple ways that we need to approach this to have success.
That's awesome. I wanted to come back, Tim. You had flagged the need to have sort of everybody at the table, and so is there somebody today, like, who's missing from that conversation now, or in your mind, or are we moving in the right direction, or is there a particular I hate the word stakeholder, but I'm gonna use it anyway. Is there a particular player that isn't engaged that needs to be more so?
Yeah, I would say, just a little bit of backstory on me. I've been with Shanos for 20 years, and back 17 years ago when I was a project coordinator, I was actually an energy modeler, and so kind of been down the rabbit hole a little bit in how these models actually work. I would say that the energy modelers need to be at the table right out of the gate, because you want to do an energy retrofit, it's all driven by energy savings or avoidance. And the scope of work to find the optimum payback, the scope of work is often defined by low-hanging fruit in the energy model. And there's really advanced tools that are being used these days. There's firms like Integral Group that have some very advanced parametric modeling tools. And you combine that with VDC and BIM, you can do some amazing analysis very early. You don't have an architect at the table. You're just working through the numbers, and you can very quickly converge on what an optimal scope of work starts to look like when you're dealing with one of these buildings that's at nearing end of life. And I don't see enough of that happening. There's lots of theories and performas about what it might look like, but no one's talked to the energy modelers. And I think that's the key point there.
Interesting. I was thinking about Tim, on the integrated project delivery and some of the sort of crown jewels in your portfolio. And I was wondering, this is a question for all three speakers, is we're sort of looking at what are the other enablers of success. So what is success? I guess success is when you have minimized embodied carbon, ultra minimized embodied carbon, gas-free, electrified, ultra efficient buildings. And what would you say currently of the portfolio that you play with meets those criteria? And what would it take to go from where we are now to meeting that criteria? What would be some of the key enablers to success? So what are we talking? 10% of the portfolio that meet that criteria? Gas-free, fully electric, ultra efficient?
I'll take a stab at an answer to that. There is a strong correlation between our most collaborative, the collaborative delivery methods, and our ability to deliver value for the client. In a traditional hard bid, get 3 contractors to give you a price. All the value is defined by the work that you've done with the design team beforehand. In a delivery method that allows us to come to the table, not just us as the general contractor, but our entire supply chain, and bring our expertise to the table in a way that delivers value for the client, that always gives more value to the client. And so that's the commonality for us. Early engagement of project participants, bring the experts to the table, early stage, have a financial and commercial terms in place so that you're making sure you're not being taken advantage of as a client. That's pretty easy to do. Get the right people there, and tons of value falls out of that.
And Ugo, you talked about the sort of the paradigm shift going from minimizing CapEx to minimizing all in X with an emphasis on OpEx over time, and carbon reductions, especially in an environment where that will be part of the regulatory landscape and pricing landscape. What will, there's principal agent issues in terms of who pays the OpEx, who pays the CapEx. From your vantage point, what do you think is the best way to address that and get the emphasis over onto the OpEx away from the CapEx?
Yeah, so well, echo exactly what Tim said, right? First of all, is having the right partner at the table, right? Two is having a full visibility on the full life cycle of what you want to achieve, right? So when and it's also leveraging technology at every step. So you start from your concept, right? You start using your BIM, you start modelizing 3D, you start modelizing energy, right? Which integrates with BIM and Revit and different platforms. Then you move on to your construction platforms. Like we purchased RIB. We just spent a few bucks on a global software company that allows us to do the full construction cycle, where you can see, you can inject BIM in it, you can start timing, you can start modelizing the effectiveness of what you're putting in. You can also start having the right partners involved at the right time during the construction phase, right? Having also the cohesiveness, planning the interference between the systems, the mechanical platforms, and then it transfers seamlessly to the operation side. And that's really the disconnect we see a lot of places where you've built something, but then the OPEX phase comes in, the operators comes in, they start overriding manually, manual stuff. They start decreasing the efficiency of your vision. And then that's where you need supervisory systems. You need tools that allows you to review the operation real time, all the time, and then correlate between, hey, I'm the owner, is what I want, and this is what my operators are doing, right? And it's not about being a big brother, but it's about making sure that all the players in the in the supply chain and the OPEX phase are all aligned in achieving one single thing: effectiveness, right? Efficiencies. I'm saying one single thing, but really it's really three things: efficiency, resilience, and occupant well-being, right? These are really important. But the technology is really the glue for me, because the software, the data is all there. Why not leverage it on top of the right players like Tim, like the right owners like Rob, right? And having the perfect buildings out there.
Interesting, you use the term big brother, and investors are not the big brother, but they're sort of the overarching structure. So Rob, I guess if we're focusing specifically on this idea of integrated project delivery and overseeing the operation of the building, if you think about embodied carbon and how the building is used, what are some of the key enablers of success to drive decarbonization there?
Well, I mean, from embodied carbon perspective, we need to be finding solutions to that issue in terms of materials that we're choosing. You know, there's a lot of work going on in the concrete space right now. Concrete is the largest material emitter of carbon globally in terms of construction materials. So we need solutions there, and I know there are some that are starting to become more mainstream. Same with steel. There are key elements of a building that sort of are the drivers of the main pieces of the embodied carbon. We need to be demanding that suppliers are addressing these things, that product declaration sheets or environmental product declaration sheets are not just including some of the materials or components that are in those materials, but are including information around carbon within the process of acquiring and building that. But to the earlier question, Elizabeth, about who needs to be engaged, I think certainly from an owner's perspective, there's a couple things. We need to engage certainly on the design and construction side. The modeling, the energy modeling piece is a great example, but I think beyond that, we need to ensure that the model is actually reflective of the reality of how a building is truly operating once it's up and running. And beyond that, I think the most important area that we need to do better with is with respect to tenants and bringing them on very early in the process. We have tenants that have significant goals around their own ESG targets, and why are we should be leveraging their goals and ours together to ensure that the building we're building is not only meeting a requirement from a base building perspective, but it's meeting a needs requirement that they have. And maybe they can be meeting their carbon goals through the efficiency of the building that we're providing to them. It doesn't help necessarily to provide a base building that is certified to LEED or whatever standard we're going for, but the tenant isn't necessarily building to that standard within their own space. So there needs to be updates regarding lease language. There needs to be updates regarding cost sharing, savings sharing through energy efficiencies. There's a whole bunch of areas that I think we can address on that question.
So I wanted to shift to the question that we always want to ask: how do we make the numbers work? How do we pay for it? Tim, you already alluded to the need for longer paybacks, and I do want to encourage folks are getting active using the Q&A widget. That's awesome. Keep doing it. Add your questions, and also please upvote questions that you see that are relevant, because those float up to the top for Toby and I and for the panelists, so we can make sure to focus in on those key ones. So coming back to that question of how do we make the numbers work? What are the rules for both public and private investment? And linking to a question that's come in through the Q&A, linked to affordability. So where we see tenants, wanting to be in healthy environments, but sometimes having to make choices between healthy environments and affordability. And so how do we start to tackle that? And maybe Rob, I'll start back again with you as the owner. And then I think this is one we'd love to hear from all three panelists again.
Sure. So, I mean, the model needs to change. I think the discussion a little bit has revolved around CapEx versus OpEx. I mean, if you start from the premise of not of who's paying, but of what the right thing to do is, I think that's the best place to start, and then work out the sort of financial components of that as you work through it. But again, if as an owner, we're not thinking longer term in terms of who's going to be leasing or renting our spaces or occupying our spaces, not a year from now, but 5, 10, 15 years from now, what are the types of spaces that we want to be giving them? And how do you do that in a way that's affordable so that you're securing sort of long-term lease agreements and they're meeting their ESG objectives through that process, as I've already stated. So there are a number of levers to pull there from a financing perspective, from government support. I saw a question come up in the chat regarding incentives. That's certainly something that needs to continue. But I think there need to be greater demands through legislative and policy requirements around how we need to operate buildings. We've seen examples of that, particularly in the US and New York, related to upcoming legislative requirements that are going to penalize building owners financially if they're not performing at a certain level in terms of emissions. We've seen signs of that type of thing through disclosure programs in Canada, through the EWRB program in Ontario, for example, but it needs to go further than that. And I think pushing landlords to provide buildings that address those concerns ultimately will lead to better discussions with tenants, in terms of affordability and how we can work together just to solve that issue.
Thanks, Rob. Tim, I'll move next to you, but Hugo, you're coming up next. So, Tim, what are your thoughts on this? How do we make the numbers work? Or are there particular innovations you're seeing in the space that can help address those needs for longer payback periods? What's your thoughts on this one?
I think Rob's got it 100% right. If you start with what's the right thing to do and then tackle the numbers, I think too many times the numbers wag the dog here. And this, I'll kind of nerd out here for 15 seconds. But what usually ends up happening, and you got to keep in mind the context that we come from, is 85% of our work is taxpayer funded. So we're talking about doing big renovations for municipalities, those sorts of clients, or post-secondaries, there's another sector. So they've got all these crappy assets from 1985 and they have no money. And they got to figure out how to modernize these things and extend the lifespan by 30 years. I think there's a place in there for a form of P3 light financing. The performers actually work. But the thing that is really tough to get your head around is when you do these big energy retrofits, the floor plan usually gets revised, and you usually end up being able to put 30 or 40% more people in the same floor plate. And people are like cattle, they give off heat. And so you actually don't realize your energy savings when you do that. You densify the building, you're not actually saving any energy. What you're doing is you're saving yourself from the need to build a building with a whole bunch more people in it. And the financial analysis and the business case, I think, really needs to start to wrap its head around that dynamic.
Hugo, over to you. We have this massive technology opportunity that we need to capitalize on and integrate. How do we pay for it?
Yeah, well, it's kind of funny. One comment regarding Tim's thing about coddling people in the building, right? So we've realized one thing, that most people ask for more space because they say they have more people to put in, right? But often what we've noticed is meeting rooms are not used, some desks are not being used, and then we've really pushed the envelope when it comes to workplace advisement and workplace optimization, real-time, dynamic location, where you can actually guide people to their desk in the morning. Say, you know what? Right now, there's only 1,200 people for a 33,000 people building. Well, let's redirect people from the second story to the third story, right? When you have a tenant that covers the whole building, we're able to go from in our headquarters in France, we're able to add 500 employees without adding space, because what happened, we just optimized the space, right, dynamically. But I think fundamentally, when it comes to what needs to change to make the numbers work, I think we need to push people, and we need to push the way we do things, right? Building codes needs to change. We need to force people to think differently. We're all humans, we're rational, right? So it's all about money often, it's about different things, but we need to force people to invest in the right things in the right way, to design and then put the technology, put the material, retrofit the buildings when it's time to retrofit them. And as you mentioned, the governments are, I mean, they've been emptying buildings, moving into new buildings. That building is 50 years old, has not been invested in. The owner was renting that space, had a good 50 years, but now he's got this building that nobody wants anymore, right? So when you retrofit, you just do the face plating to attract people, or you do a core change to meet the carbon requirements. And that's where the code, the legislation, the acceptance of tenant, the visibility of what you're trying to achieve in the market, the lead, the well branding. We need to have a cohesive approach. If not, people are always going to say, well, let's change the counters, let's put more bowl and change the carpet, then let's bring more people in the building, right? And unfortunately, it's never going to achieve our decarbonization needs. It's really a challenge, but at the end of the day, is financially, we need to be able to have clarity on, if you can provide certitude in terms of, this is the investment we're putting in the building, this is the return on reducing energy footprint, reducing carbon emission, reducing these things, then you can correlate the certainty you have on what you're going to achieve with the money you're going to put in. Once you do that, people will invest, people will finance, the banks will get in, right? But how do we guarantee something? Technology is one angle.
Hugo, I would just quickly add that when you do these, like you take a crappy building from the 80s and turn it into LEED Platinum, your fuel source is generally almost all electric on the other side of that adventure. And you have almost no natural gas. And so that walks you into a conversation about decarbonizing the power grid. I think Canada's doing some really good things there. But all of it has to happen at the same time.
No, I agree. And I think if you think from a city standpoint, why don't we have more city? I'll talk about Canada, but why don't we have more smart cities in projects in Canada, where we provide energy sources that can be moved around the microgrid approach, right? Where from building to building, from a neighborhood to neighborhood, where we have a solar power over here, we have wind power over here, we have thermal energy from the lake, for example. N-Wave downtown Toronto is a good example where we're moving energy, right, to optimize cooling. We need to have more of these projects where we start investing in generating local energy and saving energy and basically storing energy during off-peak time, when we're not using gas, when we're using hydro, or using other sources that are renewable to generate energy, right?
So there's
it ties to my, sorry, Elizabeth, it ties to my point earlier of how there isn't one sort of line of thinking here. We need to, there's multiple pieces that need to come together at the same time, which has been a challenge historically. The industry has evolved in some ways, but in many ways, when you think, we kind of design and build and operate buildings the same way that we have been for a long time, with improvements that are inherent in progress, but huge opportunities to leverage some of those things together. And if there was a rethinking of the incentives that governments or utilities can offer, I would say that incent companies on pace, on speed, rather than strictly on kilowatt hour savings or some of those things. If we can move the needle here faster, it's a benefit to everybody. But in order to do that, you need to bring in all of these elements and work on them in tandem.
Thanks, Rob. I wanted to turn to a question that's come in through the Q&A app, because there was a couple of references in those last few comments about natural gas, electrification, et cetera, and a question that's been upvoted to the top from Ralph Torrey. So thanks, Ralph. When we think about the potential of electrification and potential retrofits, shifting from natural gas or gas heated commercial buildings, retrofitting to heat pump systems, what are panelists' thoughts on this? Can we electrify buildings and keep electricity consumption in check? Is a specific question coming through? Is the specific question coming through here? But more broadly, in terms of some of those trade-offs, opportunities, or how gas heated or gas opportunities to use natural gas versus electrification. Open to any of the panelists that want to jump in on that one.
That's a it's $1 million question. Literally, it's $1 billion question. Certainly, from a new construction perspective, we need to be designing buildings that are primarily driven with electricity. And again, there's talk of transition fuels, which we understand, but the premise here being that every kilogram of carbon we don't put into the atmosphere is better, right? So we want to eliminate as much of the transition as we possibly can. From a retrofit perspective, there certainly are models out there to electrify, to switch to electric, air source heat pumps. Extreme cold climates, there's some challenges, obviously, still doing that, and we're trying to understand how we position ourselves in that space. And maybe Tim or Hugo can offer more technical insight on both of those, but absolutely, it has to be part of the solution.
Yeah, I would add that that is a valid concern, Ralph. I was involved in this panel that looked kind of at the electrical grid. And the thing that I haven't wrapped my head around this is that the current electrical grid was over-designed by like a factor of 3 or 4. And the stuff that's connected to it has been getting more and more efficient over time. If you think about fluorescent lights set it to LED. So I'm not totally bought in on cooking the grid as buildings transition. But there certainly is a tipping point that a good energy modeler can help you identify with a parametric model on a building by building basis. And I think that starts to be the key.
And just to add to your comment, Tim, on the grid being oversized, I think overall that's true, but I think locally there is gaps, right? If you start having electrical car in every house in your neighborhood, I guarantee you there will not be the required power for all the houses, right? It is just that we've never taught that way. So I think as we start electrifying, which is for me, and it's probably the most easiest way of having clean energy over time, right? Electrification should come from solar, wind, and some hydro. Although I saw some comments regarding the water rotting vegetables and methanes being in the atmosphere. But that being said, electricity for us is really the accelerated way of decarbonizing, right? The more you have of that, the less you have gas, the less you have you have cars that are running on gas also. So for us, it's good. This is what we're trying to do, right? The question is, where do you do it, right? Some places run on coal and run on gas. So obviously electrification might not be the right solution today, right? So you have to localize your strategy also, depending on how you run your energy.
Well, and I think there's another point there that in terms of prioritizing how you do this is key, because in the past we've maybe tried to address different building types in different regions with the same solutions. And obviously that isn't always the best way to approach it. So for electrification, what are the best regions to start that in? What are the sort of financial parameters in those areas that will allow you to address that in a sort of faster way? And what are the carbon impacts in certain parts of the country and around the world of doing that? Low carbon grids, it's not a priority probably, which makes sense, but certainly where emissions factors are higher, is this something we can address sooner? Hopefully it is.
Toby, over to you. Pick your favorite. There's lots of great questions there.
The questions are coming in fast and furious. Ralph did have a follow-up question. which was just at the building level, setting aside the grid question, are the efficiency gains combined with the heat pump electrification, is that sufficient to actually reduce the building's overall electricity consumption? Because it sounds pretty counterintuitive. Electrify a building and you reduce its need for electricity. But when you combine with deep retrofits, is that actually the case in your experience?
I'm going to say it's complicated. Yeah, like you have to model it on a building by building basis, and every building's different. That's part of the challenge with this. We did an energy retrofit to a big mall in Calgary. It was 900,000 square feet. We put $2 million into it and saved the client $800,000 a year in utilities, because they were pressurizing the corridors or the common area of the mall. It was pushing back into the tenant spaces, and they were on 100% outside air. So like there's all sorts of other variables that really come into play in the conversation. But the end game, when you go deep on these, it always heads towards power, and less gas, more power. And there's a tipping point where you don't want to push it any further.
Yeah, I'll give an interesting example. So Ottawa, right? Ottawa is right on the edge of Quebec and Ontario, two major different hydro systems, right? Cost structure is different, where it comes from is different. So there's a project, you probably heard about it, Tim, Zibi, right? They're building on both sides of the river. The designs on both sides of the river, although it's the same project, same engineers, same approach, total different mechanical system. One on the Quebec side is heat pump, right? Effective energy cost, carbon neutrality due to hydro and all sorts of different things. On the Ontario side, they chose fan coil technology, where you have a centralized approach with chillers, heating water, cooling water, right? So you can see, depending on where you are, the source of energy you have is really close, right? And then it's all about COP, right, when it comes to heat pump, right? So it's really, it's also about the size, the sun load, the temperature degree outside. So there's not any one answer on this, unfortunately.
We have another question that's been sort of upvoted to the top, and it's to do with the question of affordability. And as we sort of invest in these buildings to make them greener, we increase the asset values, but usually that comes along with increased rental rates. So how do we make it so that we can have green buildings, but not have rents that are less affordable?
And Toby, maybe an add-on to that, because there's another related question. How do we not just increase rental rates, but how does this contribute to that Build Back Better opportunity, right, post-COVID? So Tim, at the beginning, Toby, with the poll, there's a real opportunity here, right, to drive GDP growth, to drive job creation, which we don't always talk about. So just to add to that, so yes, it's about how do we keep rents affordable, but how do we do even better than that and contribute to recovery?
I would say you can't do a major energy retrofit without having someone to pay rent, and more rent usually. So I think the answer might be the National Energy Code of Canada has actually done some great things in this country. And, we're running around Canada building greenfield, ground up affordable housing and social housing, and we can deliver that very effectively. CMHC financing, all sorts of great things there. Those buildings are quite energy efficient. I think the affordability may come from new building stock as opposed to retrofits. Seeing the city of Vancouver moving towards net zero as a requirement for all construction within a few years here. I think that's the answer to that question, is my sense.
I'd agree largely with that. Our strategy related to affordable housing is largely focused on new construction, because the ability to build better buildings from the start is much easier now than it was. And it's easier to build a better building than it is to retrofit an existing one. Whether that's the right answer or the right approach, that's the current reality. So that's where the focus is. And the advantage to that is you can construct a building now that takes all these other equations or items into the equation. And it's not just about an affordable place to live or to rent, but it's also a healthier place to rent. How do you integrate with neighborhood development? How do you get into really robust sort of community engagement programs? How do people have access to high quality accessible outdoor spaces, which, as we've seen through COVID, is going to be at a premium and a demand that's going to be put on owners for sure. So it's not an easy answer to a difficult question, but certainly companies like Ivanhoe and other large real estate players are trying to address it.
How does saw a couple questions come through in this regard. How does work from home impact your businesses? You know, the potential for significant shift. You know, companies talking about hoteling their office spaces. Is there a new evolution here, or you know, what is this? What do those kinds of shifts look like for your businesses? Rob, I saw you pop off mute, so maybe we'll start with you.
I assumed you'd start with the landlord on that question. Yeah, it's been interesting for us because we have logistics facilities and residential facilities residential buildings that have obviously been impacted in the sort of inverse way, where people have been home, or logistics facilities have been operating 24/7 due to sort of e-commerce. And then on the other side, there's been office and retail that have been more heavily impacted in terms of being closed and people not being in those buildings. So it's requiring a rethink, certainly, of where those buildings and how those asset classes, are positioned going forward. But, you know, just in terms of office quickly, I think the consensus through the early stages of COVID was that people were working fine from home. But it wasn't that long until we started seeing signs that people maybe they don't miss the commute, but they miss, the social aspect of being at work and the ability to collaborate and all of those things. So we're obviously going to be seeing probably a hybrid solution upon return. But again, it's a question now of how do we provide spaces that satisfy the needs of a particular tenant, that give people an incentive to go into the office, and how do you do that safely? And give them, creative spaces that encourage them to be there. It will look different than it has previously, but it's not going to go away. And this is something that we're actively pursuing and determining on how do we do that, and how do you, on top of all that, make sure that all the important ESG components are included in that return to work piece.
Yeah, I'll answer the question from a tenant angle, right? So if you think about Schneider, it's about 140,000 employees in the world, right? You can imagine we use a lot of office space, and the strategy really accelerated and shifted due to COVID. First thing, we've reduced our footprint by 30% around the world. Simple as that. Anywhere we had 2 offices in the city, we're going down to 1. Right. Secondly, we've added dynamic shift, right, to where people can be in the office, but not all the time. Right, so you have dynamic like we heard about the workplace 2.0, 3.0, right? So we've really accelerated our methodology around having lockers for employees, but having no stationary location for them, allowing them to work at home or work from the office, right? To have both locations available to them on demand. Also adding the digital aspect to it, so you can log in, you can log off, you can assign where you want to work, right? And that really allowed us to optimize our space. And the second piece is we've been a bit more demanding towards the landlord on what we expect from our buildings, right? This is our map of things we want now. We expect obviously safety, air quality, and all that. But at the same time, we have clearly achievable goals from ESG, from the sustainability goals we have in our core business. So our locations needs to address that at the same time. So I kind of feel for you, Bob, because we're demanding a lot as tenants towards our landlord, right? And you have to deal with a change and also deal with more demands from your tenants, right? And I think this is going to be something that's going to be happening for a long time going forward.
I can tell you the Globe team's excited to get back in the office when it's safe to do so. I am a off the charts extrovert, and boy, I miss my colleagues. So it's great to get together this way. I think we have time, Toby, for just about one more question, for each of the panelists. And so maybe I'll pass it to you to have a look at the QA, think about all the great things we've heard, and pose that final question to each of the panelists before we send everybody off at the top of the hour.
Sure. So I'm just thinking this last question. It's kind of, the world has changed, and some people think it will be temporary. We'll go back to normal. Others, it will be more permanent. But the comments that were made at the beginning of the session have been replaying in my head that the most efficient building is the one you don't build. and the most efficient building is one you use. So with that in mind, if in a scenario where there's substantial reduction for commercial business space from today's base, and we continue to have people who want to live in cities and be part of communities, is there some kind of mass scope in the Build Back Better for taking commercial space and retrofitting to residential to boost the supply, increase affordability, and make use of buildings that may not otherwise be made use of, and avoid having to build completely new structures?
For sure, I'll happily start. For sure there is, and we've, adaptive reuse of existing facilities is something that we're always trying to figure out. How do we take vacancies that we currently have and maybe put them into the market under a completely separate use case in terms of the type of asset that it is, and absolutely an important thing to consider. We've got a number of ideas and a number of sort of discussions that are underway on that, and how do we most easily do that. That requires working with local communities and zoning and a whole bunch of sort of historical obstacles that I think everybody needs to be prepared to be flexible with. But ideally, when we can repurpose any asset to do something with it as opposed to build something new elsewhere, that would obviously be the preference, and certainly one that the real estate industry needs to evolve on for sure.
Yeah, I would say there's always going to be a need for adaptive reuse as the market evolves. But I'm actually pretty bullish on the commercial real estate market in Canada, and I think people do want to be back in offices, and so there certainly will be more work from home. But the fundamentals in Canada, construction activity is driven by population growth. And this one of the stats that I learned about a few years ago is this idea that Canada needs to have a population of 100 million people by the year 2100. It's the Century Initiative that espouses that, and we are ahead of track on that front. So think about it. We got to build 3 times as much stuff as we already have in this country and fix an infrastructure deficit in 80 years. I think there's going to be lots of opportunity for contractors and landlords in that adventure.
Yeah, I think it's going to be about, so there's a bit of both, right? I think if we think about office space as one thing, but if we think about buildings as a whole, right, we're going to shift and change the usage of them. I think it's going to be a mix of residential, what we have commercially, but how do we leverage commercial buildings that are going to be used differently? How do we have them support growth of population? How do we have them support environmental shift, right? How do we have them be more effective and be part of the community, or multi-purpose, right? Residential mixed with the retail, mixed with the, we've seen the emergence of that for multiple years now. How do we have them align with the new codes we're going to have, right? There's a grandfather clause where we accept that buildings are not going to be what all they can be, but at the same time, how do we push the envelope of changing that portfolio cost effectively with the right technologies? But I think for sure it's going to be a shift. We're going to have to demand more as people towards our policies or building codes. But I can only imagine that the building is there to stay. It's here to stay. It's just going to be used a bit differently in different aspects.
Listen, this has been a fantastic hour. I know we could probably talk all day on this subject. I wanted to thank our audience for all the great questions and for being active in the chat. We really encourage that. I can see you engaging with one another and posing questions, and that's just fantastic. It's exactly the kind of interactivity we hope for. So thanks for being a part of this session. Huge thank you to our speakers, of course, who are also our sponsors of this session. And I want to remind you that this is just the first activation in a series that's being supported by this group of organizations focused on breakthroughs inspired by building. So please do stay tuned to the Globe and Corporate Nights networks, to your emails and your social media channels from Globe and Corporate Nights, as we work together with these great organizations to deliver even more content and learnings, and of course driving action and outcomes in this space. We are going to be sharing answers to key questions that we weren't able to get to by email in follow-up. So watch your inboxes for that. And again, thanks to our speakers for the great questions you were able to address on the call. I do also want to encourage you to join us coming up April 13th to 15th, Globe Capital 2021, one of Globe's signature events that's again focused on how do we finance a sustainable and resilient economy. So please do look at joining us for that. Please continue to share your feedback on our events. You'll have a brief post-event survey pop up when you log out of today's session, and we would love it if you would share your thoughts on how today went. Thank you so much. Have an awesome day. To my speakers, thank you again. Stay safe, stay hopeful, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.